Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest in our series of webinars on the Solicitor's Qualifying Examination, or the SQE as we commonly refer to it, and that's what we'll refer to it throughout this webinar. Hopefully, as you've joined this webinar, you'll know that the SQE is a single, robust assessment that everybody who wants to qualify as a solicitor has to take, and we introduced the SQE last year back in September 2021, and we ran very successfully the first assessments in November 2021. And one of the biggest changes that we introduced when we introduced the new SQE route to qualification was the introduction of qualifying work experience. And as we like our acronyms at the SRA, we may refer to qualifying work experience as QWE throughout this webinar. So if we do that, what we mean is qualifying work experience. And qualifying work experience is the topic of today's webinar. My name's Maxine Waugh, and I'm Head of Education and Training at the SRA. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Richard Williams, who is our resident expert on all things to do with qualifying work experience. So Richard's going to be answering my questions today. You probably know that we've already run some webinars on qualifying work experience, and we will cover some of the same ground in today's session. We will cover some of the basics of what we mean by qualifying work experience, but we will also cover some additional content today. We have had quite a lot of interest in qualifying work experience since it became a requirement. So in today's session, we'll cover some extra detail from the questions that we've received and from our engagement with stakeholders. Now, we are able to take questions throughout the webinar, so if you do have a question, please post them in the link beneath the webinar. And we have had a few questions in advance of the webinar, so we will try and cover some of those as we go through the session as well. What I would say is we're not able to answer individual questions about individual circumstances. So we have had a few questions from people saying, this is my job, this is what I do, does this count as qualifying work experience? We won't be able to answer those types of queries today, but hopefully the tips and the guidance that we give you linked together with the information on our website will help you to be able to answer those questions for yourself. Now, I will remind you at the end of the session, but we will have a feedback evaluation form. It would be great if you would fill that out at the end of the session, but as I say, I'll remind you about that later on. So let's get started, because I know we've got quite a lot of content to cover today. So Richard, can you start off by telling us what do we mean by qualifying work experience?
Thanks, Maxine, and welcome everybody. So any individual who wants to be admitted as a solicitor, now that the SQE is in place and introduced, will need to complete, as you said, a period of qualifying work experience. So qualifying work experience is any experience of providing legal services which enables an individual to develop some or all of the competencies outlined in the statement of solicitor competence. And that statement of solicitor competence can be found on our website. In order to, I suppose, kind of count as qualifying work experience, in addition to what I've just said, it must be a minimum of 2 years in no more than 4 organisations. It must be confirmed by a solicitor or compliance officer for legal practice who we regulate. It can be gained from current or previous employment or a role or experience that you have in England and Wales or overseas. And it does not need to cover English and Welsh law. And then finally, just at the kind of the big picture level, qualifying work experience does not apply to qualified lawyers.
And that's a really important point, Richard, isn't it? Because actually there is a bit of confusion amongst qualified lawyers. So it's really important to point out for qualified lawyers, you don't need to do qualifying work experience as a requirement to qualify as a solicitor in England and Wales. So that's what qualifying work experience is, Richard. Why do we have qualifying work experience? What's the purpose of it?
Well, the purpose of qualifying work experience is to help an aspiring solicitor give them and provide them with the experience of legal work, and that gives them the opportunity to develop some or all of the competencies needed to be a competent solicitor. So it's really about socializing individuals to the work and the legal environment to help them prepare to become a solicitor. And the process of doing that enables that individual to also prepare to take the SQE2 assessment, because it gives them experience and exposure to the practical skills that are assessed as part of SQE2.
So many people are really familiar with the requirements of the period of recognised training, Richard. Does qualifying work experience mean the end of the period of recognised training as most people know it?
From a regulatory perspective, it does. So from September last year, a training contract is no longer a requirement for admission as a solicitor. And as we've said already, an aspiring solicitor will need to complete a period of qualifying work experience. And I suppose this is where one of the real big benefits of the introduction of qualifying work experience is. It really does open up admission to many more potentially competent individuals becoming a solicitor by removing the golden ticket of a training contract for admission. And we all know that requirement of a training contract for admission did create a barrier to qualification for many individuals. And I suppose it's worth just kind of taking a step back a little bit from that and perhaps just explaining why we can do that and why qualifying work experience, we have the flexibility that I've just mentioned. It's because having the SQE in place gives us, employers, everyone connected with the SQE, much greater assurances that individuals have met the required standard of competence because they've been robustly assessed through the SQE. And I suppose that gives us more confidence than the training contract, because the training contract was delivered by lots of different organisations and signed off by lots of different training principles, and there was really no consistency across how that was signed off. And I suppose that removal of the training contract also gives opportunities for organisations. Organisations that perhaps couldn't, for whatever reason, have traditionally taken on trainees can now consider whether or not they can offer qualifying work experience placements to people, given some of the prescription around the training, what a training contract looks and feels like, has been removed.
And as I mentioned, Richard, at the start of the session, we get quite a lot of queries, don't we, from people who want to understand whether the experience that they've already got does count as qualifying work experience. So to help those people, can you give us some tips on how people can determine whether or not the experience that they've got would actually count towards their qualifying work experience?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Maxine, and we do get an awful lot of people contacting us describing their particular circumstances and asking us to make a view whether or not it is qualifying work experience or not. It's really difficult for us to do that, because we obviously don't know the nature of everyone's role and job and organisation, so we can't do that. But what we can do is try and provide some helpful pointers for people to think about. So the starting point really is for employers and individuals, when trying to work out whether or not their role, job or experience is qualifying work experience, is to go back to the definition of legal activity in the Legal Services Act. And I think it's section 12 where legal activity is described. So any role, job or function that involves the provision of legal services is likely to count as qualifying work experience. That's because some or all of the competencies are likely to be involved or engaged when doing that type of work. So if you look at that definition and you think about your role and job and you think it fits within that definition, then it's more than likely to be qualifying work experience. I think just to point out that qualifying work experience must be kind of real life experience. We have lots of people asking us whether simulated legal work doesn't count. And actually it doesn't. We're very clear that given the purpose of what I described as qualifying work experience, it should be real life experience. So I think what that means is that, if you have been or currently a paralegal, a trainee, a volunteer in a law clinic or law centre, you work in-house, or you work, delivering legal services for a voluntary sector organisation, you're likely to be working under that definition of legal services and therefore qualifying work experience. The title of your role or job doesn't matter either. The key thing is that you're within that definition and you've engaged some or all of the competencies. If you can satisfy those criteria, it's likely to be qualifying work experience. We have a little bit of information on our website on this. We've actually provided, I suppose, kind of a checklist of prompts that people can have a look at. And if you answer yes to all of those prompts and questions, it's likely to be qualifying work experience. So people can go away and have a look at that.
So what I'm hearing, Richard, is there's lots more flexibility now around qualifying work experience, lot more options for people in terms of getting the work experience that they need to qualify as a solicitor. But what's really critical to that experience is getting exposure to those competencies that are required for practice as a solicitor. So what does that mean in practice? For example, one of the questions that we get asked a lot is, how many competencies does some or all of the competencies mean? Is there a magic number of competencies that people need to get?
And again, it's a really common question, so I'm glad that we've picked it up. Our regulations do not require an individual to have developed all of the competencies for their experience to count as qualifying work experience. So what we're saying is you don't have to do everything. So if we kind of look at that from a different perspective, what it does mean is when we use the term some, what we're really talking about here is a minimum of 2. So in order for your experience, job or role to qualify as qualifying work experience, it must be delivering legal services and must have engaged a minimum of 2 competencies. And it doesn't matter which competencies are, we don't prescribe what they are. So if you have a look at our statement of solicitor competence, and you can say, well, actually, in my role, job or experience, I've done that one, and I know it's legal services, then that's qualifying work experience. But I suppose that's not the full picture, though, and I think that can be a little bit misleading. So I think it's also important for individuals to think about what exposure that they have had, because really what this is about is trying to expose candidates to the full set of competencies, experiences, knowledge, skills that will be assessed as part of SQE2. So in order to make the most of qualifying work experience as a learning opportunity, you might well have a minimum of 2, which satisfies your requirement from, I suppose, a kind of a regulatory perspective. But I think it's really important to ask yourself whether or not that's going to give you the best opportunity of passing the SQE2, or whether or not you need to get any more experience to more competencies.
So exposure to these competencies then is really critical. I think we've made that very clear. And you've touched on it there, Richard, but how can people work out which competencies they've been exposed to? Is there a list?
There is. I suppose that the best starting point is to have a look at our template. We've developed a template which outlines all of the competencies in the statement of solicitor competence, and I'd encourage people that who might be thinking about using their current experience as qualifying work experience to take a look at that template, think about the job that they're doing, perhaps look at their job description or role profile, and look at how that matches the competencies. And in that template, you can record how you've met that competence. I just want to be absolutely clear that that template, it's not a regulatory requirement to complete it, or for you to keep that as a record, or employees to use that. it's just simply there as an aid and a tool for individuals and organisations who might have people wanting to claim qualifying work experience to understand which competencies they may have or may not have met.
So really what we're saying, Richard, is that there's not just flexibility in terms of how you get your qualifying work experience and where you get it, but there's also quite a lot of flexibility in terms of how people record it and how it actually works for them in practice with their employer in their workplace. But we do have help and resources. We do have templates which people can use and access if they choose to, but those are not requirements. So let's move on to how people actually record their qualifying work experience. Again, this is an area that we do get quite a lot of confusion about it, because I think people think that in order to record their qualifying work experience with us, they have to send us in a form. And that's not the case, is it, Richard?
No, you don't have to. Candidates don't have to send any evidence or documentation to us when registering their qualifying work experience with us. What you will need to do is create an account on MySRA. If you already have a MySRA account, you'll need to log in. You'll be then asked to confirm details about your qualifying work experience, so where you obtained it and the length of the placement in months and weeks. You will then need to provide details of the solicitor or CULP confirming your qualifying work experience. And I think the critical part with that is twofold, really. It's important that you talk to the solicitor or CULP who's confirming your qualifying work experience in advance to make sure that they are happy to confirm your qualifying work experience and they've got the evidence they need to confirm it. And I know we'll come on to confirming qualifying work experience in a little while, but also secondly to get their kind of SRA ID number as well, because that will be required. So once you've done all that, you just input those details, and that is the process of registering your qualifying work experience. You don't need to send anything kind of physical. You don't need to send any records. You don't need to send the template that I mentioned to us in order to do that.
And one of the really great benefits of qualifying work experience is that it can be claimed retrospectively. So people can claim it if they have already got it before they even start their SQE assessments. How does that work, Richard? Can they claim it from a previous job or role from many years ago? Yeah,
they can. Yeah, we've said that qualifying work experience can be claimed retrospectively for a past job, placement or volunteer role, so long as it meets the conditions that I've described in terms of qualifying work experience. There's no limit on how far back someone can go either to claim qualifying work experience, so long as it does meet those conditions. I think it's important if you are thinking about using any past experience providing legal services for qualifying work experience, go and have a chat to your previous employer to discuss who could potentially confirm your experience within that organisation. People may have changed, people might have gone, for example, so just make sure there is someone there to confirm your qualifying work experience. So we're often asked a lot of questions about, could a solicitor to refuse to sign it off if I go back with a retrospective claim. So I just thought it might be helpful to clarify that at this stage. In relation to retrospective claims, we expect solicitors and CULPs to take reasonable and appropriate steps to confirm any backdated or retrospective requests for qualifying work experience. So we've been really clear on that. But there might well be circumstances under which a solicitor or a firm or an organisation that you may have previously gained experience with can't confirm your qualifying work experience despite taking reasonable and proportionate steps. For example, there may not be anyone around who can confirm the length of time you were there or the role that you did, or the organisation may not have any records or up-to-date records to evidence the fact that you were there at a particular time. So whilst we expect most people to take those steps, there might be some circumstances where it might not be possible.
So let's talk in a little bit more detail, Richard, about that actual confirmation, because that's a really important part of the regulatory requirements. What exactly are people confirming when they're confirming their qualifying work experience?
Okay, lots and lots of information in previous webinars specifically on this issue of confirming qualifying work experience. So, you know, I'd encourage people perhaps after this webinar to go and have a look at that, because there's much more detail there. But essentially, a solicitor or culp who is confirming qualifying work experience is confirming the time scale of the work experience, that experience, job, role or function provided the opportunity for the individual to develop some or all of the prescribed competencies for solicitors. And again, you know, what we're talking about here is that minimum of 2, but it could well be more. And also that no character and suitability issues arose during the work experience that raised questions about whether or not a candidate should be admitted as a solicitor. And that last point is quite important, because what we're not asking a solicitor or culp to make any judgments as to whether or not if there was a particular character and suitability issue should prevent someone from becoming a solicitor. We're just asking for the details. It's our job to make sure that we take on board that information and work out the seriousness, for example. So qualifying work experience should be confirmed where an individual has been exposed to a limited number of competencies, and as we've said, the minimum of 2. And I think if you're kind of thinking about confirmation in terms of the process of admission, confirming qualifying work experience does not mean that an individual will necessarily be admitted as a solicitor. It's just one of our requirements for admission. A confirmation means that the individual has satisfied one of the 4 criteria required for commission, and the others are meeting our character and suitability assessments and obviously passing the SQE assessments.
Now that's a really important point again, Richard, from the regulatory perspective. So let's just go back over this point again, because we do get lots of questions about it. Do solicitors and culps who are confirming qualifying work experience need to make a judgment about an individual's competence?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And we can be really, really clear on that. Confirmation of qualifying work experience, it does not involve making a judgment at all. It is about simply confirming the length of a placement. It's confirming that some of the competencies have, or all of them have been, the individual's been exposed to, and it's providing the character and suitability issues. Confirming qualifying work experience doesn't mean that you're making a judgment or deciding whether the individual is competent. The way in which an individual's competence is demonstrated is whether or not they pass the SQE, and that's the role of the SQE. Really, it's to make sure that people who are admitted are competent to do so. So that's really, you know, an incredibly robust safety net in terms of competence. Confirming qualifying work experience does not also involve making any judgments about the quality of the training or experience that someone has had, nor does it involve a judgment about the standard of their work or you know, their overall experience within a particular placement. And in terms of the solicitor and confirming qualified work experience, as I mentioned, you know, you can have confidence in confirming qualifying work experience where you may have concerns or in your own kind of judgment that perhaps someone, despite meeting a number of competencies, perhaps, you know, you have concerns around their ability because of the SQE. You know, if they're good enough, they will, and competent enough, they'll pass the SQE. If they're not, then they won't pass. So you've got that kind of safety net there in terms of signing off qualifying work experience.
And another benefit of qualifying work experience is that the solicitor who's signing off the qualifying work experience doesn't need to be in the organisation where the qualifying work experience actually took place. But our requirements for that sign off are slightly different, aren't they, Richard? So can you just explain to us how that works?
That's right. And I think, it's important to point out why we think that's important, because, what we're talking about here, and you've touched on it, is flexibility. It's about giving people more opportunities to qualify and become admitted as a solicitor, so long as they're competent enough. So, in most cases, a solicitor or CULP will work in the organisation where the individual is obtaining or claiming their qualifying work experience. But we know some organisations may not have a solicitor work or CULP working in them, but that organisation is actually providing legal services. So, people could use that organisation and experience gain that as qualifying work experience. So what we've said is that, a solicitor outside of that organisation can confirm qualifying work experience. But as you pointed out, there's a couple of caveats to that. Firstly, in confirming qualifying work experience, that solicitor or CULP will need to have reviewed the work that the individual has delivered or carried out during the relevant period of work experience claimed. And secondly, they would need to receive feedback from a person or persons who's had some kind of oversight or supervision of their work. So there are, if you are a solicitor or you're thinking about approaching a solicitor outside of the organisation, there's two very important points there to think about.
Now, this next point, Richard, you have already covered to a certain extent, but I think it's a really, really important point. So let's just go back over this again. We do get sometimes candidates calling us to say that their employer or their supervisor won't sign off their qualifying work experience. Is this allowed? Are people allowed to say, no, I'm not going to sign off your qualifying work experience?
I think our starting point with that is that we would expect all solicitors and CULPs to meet their much wider regulatory obligation to act honestly and not to take advantage of any individuals. So with that in mind, we would expect any qualifying work experience that meets the criteria that I've talked about today to be confirmed. So, and just to reiterate, that qualifying work experience should be confirmed, notwithstanding any concerns that an individual has about their competence or their character and suitability. And as we said, competence is demonstrated through the SQE. But within that kind of operating within your kind of wider regulatory obligations, I did make the point that you can still fulfil that, but not sign off qualifying work experience, whereby you may not have, for example, had an opportunity to review the work, or there are no records to confirm someone's placement or experience or the work that they did. So, I think the key, if you are in a position where it's legitimate for you to refuse to confirm qualifying work experience, be clear with the person as to why it is. I think that's an absolutely critical point.
Now, we don't want people to be disadvantaged in any way, Richard, do we? If people legitimately think that they have got qualifying work experience and their employer won't sign it off, what can they do? Can they call the SRA?
There's probably a few steps that individuals might want to think about taking. And again, this information is available on our website in a little bit more detail. But I think the first step someone should think about taking is asking themselves whether or not I've got all the evidence I need to be able to demonstrate that I have met some or all of the competencies. And again, we don't prescribe what that evidence should look like, but we do have a template that people can use as a starting point. Probably the second step is have a conversation with the solicitor or CULP who might well be refusing to confirm your qualifying work experience. Try and get some clarification on what the grounds for refusal are. Is it a lack of understanding, or is it something more substantive, perhaps? You can also think about perhaps inviting someone else or someone who might well have been supervising your work, if they're not the one signing it off, to be able to kind of to provide further evidence that you've met some or all of the competencies. So that might be something people want to consider. But you might well do all of that, and it might not get you very far. So if you get into that situation, then my suggestion would be, to call our qualifying work experience helpline. And the purpose of that is really to pick up these types of situations whereby, there is qualifying work experience that looks legitimate, but is being refused to be confirmed. And if you find yourself in that situation, we can get involved. We can have conversations with the solicitor or COLP, and try and kind of get to the bottom of it and try and get a resolution to ensure that qualifying work experience is confirmed if it's appropriate to do so.
And just one more question then about confirmation of qualifying work experience. Again, a question that we get asked quite regularly. How will an employer know that we want them to confirm qualifying work experience?
Yep. Once a candidate has entered the details of you as a confirming solicitor or compliance officer for legal practice, and provided your SRA name and number, you will get an email alert to say that there is some qualifying work experience there for you to confirm. You can then log into your My SRA account and you'll be shown a list of qualifying work experience that requires your confirmation. It's very intuitive. You can look at the individuals, you can click on an individual, go into their record, check the details, and then there's a checkbox for you to go, okay, I've reviewed this, I'm happy, I'm confirming it. So it's quite a simple and quick process.
Okay, thanks very much, Richard. So let's move on from the confirmation of the qualifying work experience. We've also had quite a few questions from paralegals who say if they pass the SQE and they qualify as a solicitor, does their employer then need to employ them as a solicitor? What's the position here?
This isn't really a regulatory issue. This really is an employment issue. Whether or not an individual who's passed the SQE is employed as a solicitor is a decision for the employer. They can decide whether to employ the individual as an admitted solicitor or continue to employ them in the role that they had before they took the SQE and became admitted. We think it's really good employment practice, but again, not a regulatory requirement for employers to have early, open and honest conversations with an individual about their role or their progression with an organisation if and when they pass the SQE.
So just to be clear then, Richard, if an employer decides not to employ someone as a solicitor, even though they're on our roll of solicitors, does that person need to be called a solicitor?
No, their job title is a matter for their employer, providing it's not misleading to clients. So, however, where a firm decides to continue to employ an individual who has qualified through the SQE and in a non-solicitor role, for example, as a paralegal that we've talked about, that they will still need to comply with our regulatory requirements for a solicitor. So the individual will, for example, need a practicing certificate and will need to comply with their continuing competence obligations.
Thanks, Richard. So we've talked about all the benefits of qualifying work experience, of which there are many, but some people have always been concerned about qualifying work experience, and they have been concerned that some employers may take advantage of people who want to qualify as a solicitor, and they may not give them the exposure to the competencies that they need. They may not give them a good quality qualifying work experience during their period of training. What's the SRA doing about this?
You're right, Maxine, and it's something we're very, very alive to, and we have a number of controls in place to both monitor and understand whether or not there are some of the issues that you've mentioned, kind of happening really. So I've mentioned the dedicated qualifying work experience helpline. So that gives us a really good opportunity and a good kind of thermometer into what's happening. We can take a temperature check of what the issues are, what the challenges are. Is this a systemic issue with confirming qualifying work experience within an organisation or in a particular sector? So we're constantly monitoring that type of data to help us understand how it's playing out. There'll also be an annual survey of qualifying work experience, again, to understand what this is looking like in practice and whether or not there are any issues that we need to address. And I suppose kind of on a more formal basis, there will be a wider SQE evaluation, of which qualifying work experience will be part of that, and that will be a quite comprehensive evaluation program. So we think through those controls, through our regular ongoing engagement with lots of different types of organisations. It gives us a really good understanding of what's happening out there.
So finally then, Richard, what further support is there available from the SRA to help organisations and individuals to understand and implement qualifying work experience?
Okay, I've already mentioned we have a wide range of resources on our website. Those resources are aimed for aspiring solicitors, for candidates, and we also have resources for employers or organisations who might well be offering qualifying work experience, and they cover lots of the things that we've talked about today in much more detail. So we're constantly refreshing and updating that guidance. So it's worth kind of checking in periodically with that. And obviously, if we do make substantive updates, we can let people know through our monthly SQE bulletin, for example. I would suggest also as well that people have a look at our SQE LinkedIn group as well. And our career in law, where people can listen to what other people are doing, get up to date with information, for example. And then I suppose from a kind of an organisational angle perspective on qualifying work experience, we're also in the process of setting up a virtual community for organisations to get together to kind of share some best practice, share their approaches, and share how they are addressing some of the trickier issues that we've discussed today. So that gives a good opportunity for those organisations to kind of help each other out.
That's great. Thanks very much, Richard. I think now we're going to move on to some of the questions that we have received. And the first question that we've had is, can qualifying work experience be obtained before you take SQE2?
Yes, it can. We imagine most candidates will do qualifying work experience between SQE1 and SQE2, but there is nothing in our regulations to stop it being done before. So I think it's just important to point that out. And if you are thinking of doing qualifying work experience after you've done SQE1, I think it's important to think about how you've been exposed and what competencies you've been exposed to before you take SQE2, because SQE2 does test those practical skills, legal skills and knowledge. So it's important to think, have I had exposure to, or had enough exposure to, the things that are going to be assessed in SQE2? So people might want to think about that when deciding whether they are ready to take SQE2.
So another great example there, Richard, of the flexibility around the new route to qualification under the SQE. You can take your qualifying work experience before you take the assessments, whilst you're taking the assessments, or after you've taken the assessments, which is a great flexibility for people. So we've had another question in now, which is, does working part-time in an organisation count as qualifying work experience?
Yeah, part-time experience can count. Our requirement is for 2 years full-time equivalent experience or gained on a part-time basis. We are not going to prescribe what part-time equivalent looks like. We're not going to provide a calculation for how you arrive at a part-time equivalent figure. We expect and we know that organisations have their own calculations and own approaches to that. So, we don't need to enter that space. So when you're confirming qualifying work experience, just take a common sense view with it. Really, it would be my advice.
Great, thanks, Richard. And then we've got one more question which came in before the webinar, which is, can a barrister or a qualified lawyer from another jurisdiction confirm qualifying work experience?
The answer to that one, Maxine, is a no. Qualifying work experience can only be confirmed by a solicitor or compliance officer of legal practice who we regulate. And this would therefore exclude a kind of a barrister or qualified lawyer from another jurisdiction.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Richard. Now, we were going to take some questions now that had come in during the webinar, but we think, and I must apologise for this, we think there's probably been a problem with the link to the questions that comes underneath the webinar. So unfortunately, we can't answer any of your questions. If you have sent them in, I do apologise to you. Please do get in touch with us if you did ask us a question and we didn't answer it through the session today, or we just didn't receive the question. Richard had put up the slide, the getting in touch slide earlier, so please do get in touch with us and we will do our best to answer your queries or to make sure that your query is answered on our website. Thank you very much for listening to this webinar. I hope you found it useful. And just a reminder again, please can you fill out our feedback form, which is in the link under the webinar. It's really important to us to know what you think about these webinars. And also please let us know if there are other topics that you would like to hear from us, and we'd be very happy to do future webinars on those. So thank you very much.